Hey, Mr. Binks, you know how I'm obsessed by dog history and history of cats. And that's why we're jumping on Zoom now to speak to Dr. Paul Koudounaris about his amazing world first book called Faithful Unto Death. And yes, you got it. It's a tour of pet cemeteries around the globe and what that really tells us about mankind. I'm Anna Webb. Welcome to A Dog's Life. Dr. Paul Koudounaris, I can't be more excited to welcome you onto A Dog's Life all the way from California.
And I am so delighted to be talking to you, to talk to an audience that really appreciates this material and I think is really going to understand the importance of it.
Well, I really do hope so, because what we're going to be talking about is your amazing new book, Faithful Unto Death. And certainly all my listeners, have gone through the terrible time that inevitably will come where you have to say goodbye. But in your book, you're really analysing burials, which in a way is also talking about death, but through pet cemeteries around the world, and focusing in that, you're really looking at how us humans have changed over the centuries, or have we? This is the big question. But either way, what impresses me is this book that is so beautifully compiled. And it is, do you think, Dr. Paul, the first ever book on pet cemeteries globally?
It's the first of its kind. I'm a bit of a masochist, and I always like to get involved in projects no one's ever done. There have been a couple books about pet cemeteries. When I got into this research, I found that some pet cemeteries had released their own little self-published book about their own history, but nothing that was comprehensive. There is a little book in the UK. It's a little paperback book by a woman named Toms, where she had traveled around the UK in the past and sort of compiled a list of animal graves, but there's not much history and not much context in it. But it's wonderful if anyone's just looking for individual graves in the UK. She's compiled a whole large list. But yeah, this is certainly the only one of its kind that is international, that tries to tie together the way we mourn as something that is both individual but also universal, because we see it across culture. I've got pictures. I've traveled down to Egypt to take a picture of the modern pet cemetery in Cairo. I took pictures in Bali at the pet cemetery there. I took pictures in Thailand. There's in the introduction, there's a kind of little collage of some international pictures. I took pictures in Bangkok at this temple where they provide animal funerals. So while we deal in the book with individual instances, there's this underlying aspect of it that this is something that's universal.
Well, that is interesting, because something, you talk about in the book is, I suppose, well, particularly with the Paris cemetery, which we'll talk about in greater detail, somewhere where I've actually been twice, is this, how would you call it, the sacrilege of the church, obviously in Paris, mainly Catholic, that, this, you can't bury pets. There can't be any religious symbolism going on here, because clearly dogs and cats and other animals, they don't go to heaven, because only humans go to heaven. So there is this underlying thing. And of course, in Thailand, they're Buddhists.
Well, okay. So when you get into Asia, you get into cultures that have this transmigration of the soul. And so you might start, especially when you get into reincarnation, right? You might be a person, and in the next life you might be a butterfly. So the soul can actually transmigrate, and it creates a lot less of this hierarchy among beings, a lot less of this idea that humans have to be number one, because maybe the human form might be considered divine, but the soul itself is more divine, and the soul can go back and forth. This idea, though, I'd like to address this, and thank you for bringing this up, because this idea that animals don't go to heaven is so absolutely absurd. It's just bad, lazy theology. And it's something that I got into when I started to look at the spiritual underpinnings of these animal burials. If you go back to the early Christian church, nobody denied that animals had a soul. The only thing they debated was the nature of the animal's soul. And there was this question. It's like, well, why would animals be denied paradise, eternal paradise, because who got animals kicked out of paradise in the first place? Human beings did. It was our transgression, not theirs. But somehow this idea that animals were not members of the faith, therefore they were not welcome in the cemeteries. That's why pet cemeteries eventually had to exist, because you couldn't bury an animal in the churchyard because it wasn't a member of the parish. This idea that, well, they weren't a member of the parish, they weren't a member of the faith, therefore, if they're not a member of the faith, they're not eligible for salvation, therefore they can't go to heaven. And like I said, it's just bad, lazy theology. One of the most important American theologians of the 20th century, Billy Graham, a very famous televangelist, he himself said it can't possibly be heaven if my dog's not there.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's, and it's kind of scary, I think, being a human, that
Yeah.
I don't know what will happen, obviously, after death, but I so don't want to go somewhere where there aren't any animals, let alone, my own animals that I've looked forward to being reunited with.
Well, I don't think you're going to have that problem. There's no justifiable theological reason to leave them out of paradise. And there's no justifiable reason to tell us it's paradise and they're not eligible to be there.
Well, no, I mean, I certainly agree with you on that front. While we're talking about this, though, you brought my attention to something which I found absolutely so fascinating and extraordinary. And I will thank you for this forever. You led me to the wonderful woman who wrote the original, or came up with the concept, or she wrote a poem.
She wrote it.
She wrote the poem called The Rainbow Bridge. Elaborate a little bit more, Dr. Paul, please.
Her name is Edna Klein Recce. She lives in Inverness, Scotland. It's a fascinating story. The Rainbow Bridge had always been unattributed. And if I'm writing a book about pet cemeteries, you can't go to a modern pet cemetery and not see a reference to the Rainbow Bridge, even if it just says, I'll see you on the other side of the bridge, or people's pets might pass and they'll say, so-and-so went to the bridge today. And I couldn't have a book about pet cemeteries that didn't have an author for that. Even though I wasn't going to make a big deal of it, I had to attribute that to somebody. So I spent a really long time, like not a single chunk of time, but a period of over several years, just like, all right, let's start that Rainbow Bridge thing again. Who wrote this damn thing? I finally found her. There were a lot of people who tried to claim that poem, and I went and I looked at U.S. copyright records, and this is the United States alone. There were over 20 people who tried to copyright it as theirs. None of them wrote it. The woman who wrote it, she wrote it in the 1950s. She was 19 years old at the time. She was just a young girl. Her dog Major had died. And she told me, I got the first interview she ever gave about the Rainbow Bridge. And she told me that she felt Major talking to her after she had died, like Major was moving her hand. And she pulled a piece of paper out of her sister's notebook and started scribbling these words. And there were almost no corrections because the original handwritten manuscript of the Rainbow Bridge, she still has it. She still has that piece of paper. There are almost no corrections. The Rainbow Bridge, as we know it now, is almost verbatim what came out of this 19-year-old girl in the 1950s. And eventually, she didn't make anything of it. She showed it to some friends, and they're like, oh, this is lovely. Can we copy it? So they copied it. They started passing it around. In the meantime, she married a physician from India. So she moved to India. So she lived most of her adult life in India. So she had no idea this was becoming a major thing. And then after her husband retired, they bought an olive farm in rural Spain, another place where no one's talking about the Rainbow Bridge, right? So it was only after her husband got Alzheimer's and died that she moved back to Scotland. And then every once in a while, people would say, hey, Edna, that thing you wrote when you were a kid, I heard some reference to it. And so when I tracked her down, I'm the one who really had to explain to her, because she's in her 80s now. It's like, no, Edna, you don't understand. What you wrote has touched millions of people from around the world. It is known around the world. And it was a revelation to her. She was absolutely shocked. And I said to her, are you aware that Dear Abby, who's a very famous American newspaper columnist, are you aware that Dear Abby shared the original words of the Rainbow Bridge with 100 million American readers? And her response was just, who's Dear Abby? She had no idea.
Gosh, well, you see this, what humility,
Yeah.
and how kind not to be wanting even to copyright it.
No,
And
she's a gem, a real gem. And I'll tell you a very funny anecdote. So I wrote an article about it, and after the article comes out, Edna told me, she got back to me. She says the funniest thing happened because she still has dogs, and she took her dogs into the veterinarian's office. And the veterinarian had apparently read this article, and the veterinarian comes in and he looks at her and he says, Edna, did you read the Rainbow Bridge? For 20 years, when people's pets have passed away, I've handed them a copy of that without realizing that one of my clients wrote it.
you see, this is just amazing.
Yeah,
And
it's really a weird story.
yeah, but the premise of the Rainbow Bridge is that, your beloved dog or cat, will wait for you,
Mhm.
and then you together will cross the bridge, right?
Yes, and part of the reason that the Rainbow Bridge has proven so popular and has touched so many people is because it's because of its vagueness and its simplicity, because it's so perfect that it can kind of fit in as a theological plug-in to any faith system that you're a part of without creating some kind of, unorthodoxy. Like you can plug it into Christianity, you can plug it into Wicca, you can plug it into animism, you can plug it into Buddhism, whatever you want. You can find a way to kind of fit the Rainbow Bridge because it's not actually denying anything that's a part of your faith. It's just saying that there's this kind of, uh, idyll, this kind of Arcadian landscape. And when you die, you're going to go there, you're going to meet your pets, and you're going to cross over into the hereafter together. So it doesn't really contradict anything you might believe in your faith. And that's part of the reason that it's been so popular, especially in the United States and Europe, because people have been inculcated falsely into this idea that animals don't go to heaven or animals don't get an afterlife. They don't have a soul or something. So it provides this kind of theological plug-in that allows us to see our pets again. And that's part of the reason it's comforted so many people.
Yes, absolutely. And it kind of justifies as well the book in a way to celebrate these pet cemeteries,
Sure.
without doubt. But it's fascinating how, with time and with history, how pet cemeteries have kind of evolved, as
Sure.
they're all kind of, I mean, would you agree, late Victorian? So you're kind of 1870s,
Yeah.
1890s. That's
Yeah.
when the first one started to happen with much shock and much to do, right?
Yeah, there is a point I make in the introduction of the book, and it's a vitally important point, and it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around at first, and it needs a little bit of an explanation. We invented pets in the 19th century, and that doesn't mean people didn't have animals around before them and they didn't love them. Of course they did, but modern pets, as we know them, are a 19th century invention. They're really a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. People are moving to the big cities. For the first time, you have people living in major metropolitan areas rather than in the countryside, and they bring this taste for animal husbandry with them. But now they're living with animals in a completely new context, in a different way. They're living with them in close quarters, both physically and also emotionally, because living with them so closely in an urban environment changes the emotional relationship we have with them. And also animals start to be considered a symbol of their owner, like a status symbol of the person who owns them. And so the way we treat animals, the way we live with them, even the way we feed them, the first animal ownership manuals, grooming manuals, everything, all that stuff, the way we live with them as family members, all of that really starts in the 19th century. They become members of the family in a way they haven't before. They're allowed to live and be loved as family members, but one thing that they are still being denied is the ability to die like a family member, the ability to have that good death, the ability to die with dignity the way a human relation would. That is considered very eccentric, even though our relationship with animals has changed in the 19th century. And there are a lot of stories, just really wacky stories about people who tried to bury their animals, their pets, in their own family funeral plot. And there's a story I talk about in the book about a woman in Scotland who she had a family plot. She tried to bury her cat there, and there was this riot. They had to lock the doors of the cemetery, and people were scaling the walls, and they pulled the casket with the cat out from her hands, and they grabbed the cat out of the casket, and they're holding it in the air, and the police had to be summoned. Just a complete debacle. And so special burial grounds were needed for animals. If we're going to live with them as family members, they need to be allowed to have the dignity of a good death. At the time, cremation wasn't even popular for human beings, so that was out of the question. In terms of things like taxidermy, sure, you could do that, but it was also expensive, and it wasn't to a lot of people's tastes. A lot of people did not want, Fluffy to continue on with glass eyes staring at them unmoving in the house. There needed to be some solution, and that starts in 1881 with that first urban pet cemetery in Hyde Park in London.
Yes, and that all began with a little dog called Cherry,
Yes.
wasn't it? Who I think was run over, as that tended to be the main cause of death back then, as I
No,
suppose.
Cherry wasn't run over.
Oh,
Cherry died a natural death. His family, they were bankers. They lived very close to Hyde Park. He did die a natural death. The story with Cherry is that after he passed, they lived very close to Hyde Park, and Cherry's favorite place in the world was Hyde Park, the lush green grasses. And they knew the gatekeeper, a man named Mr. Windbridge. And so they went down he lived in a cottage at the Victoria Gate. So they went down there and they knocked on his door and they said, Mr. Windbridge, you knew our dog Cherry. He was a little Maltese terrier. You knew our dog Cherry. We know you liked him and he loved you. We're devastated because Cherry's gone and there's no way to give him a good passing. Can we bury Cherry in your yard? Just a stone's throw away from his favorite place. And Mr. Windbridge was a very good-hearted man. Of course, he said, sure, you can bury Cherry out here. And so they buried him and gave him a little gravestone. And next thing someone else comes knocking. It's like, oh, Mr. Windbridge, you knew my dog, right? Can you do me that same favor? And then someone else, my cat has died. Can you do me the same favor? And eventually, in not too long a time, Mr. Windbridge's yard becomes the canine necropolis of London.
and it is amazing. You can't actually go and visit it. It's
Mhm.
tiny, and the little
Tiny.
gravestones are all uniform, and quite simply engraved. When you compare it to, say, the Paris Cemetery, which
Sure.
kind of on the other scale, it's super grand and really uber Victorian, really, and with some of the tombs, But it's very simple, Hyde Park. But you can peer through the barred gates, which I've done a couple of times, I must say, and it's really sweet. Is the only way to describe it, and it's nice that it isn't in a way open to the public.
Well,
I think
you
you can have.
can. They do some. I don't know if they still do them. For a while, they were doing very limited Hyde Park special tours, which did include the Pet Cemetery. So if you signed up for this special tour that was every couple months, they would take you through the cemetery.
Yeah, which, gosh, well, I must see if you can still do that actually. But, it's quite nice that it is set apart and
Yeah.
it keeps it quite private, I think. But yes, I mean, in your book, you do write about how I found this interesting, when you compare when the quote was written at the beginning of the 20th century about how, people were exclaiming, there's more love being given to pets than there is to children. And then you roll on another 100 years and look what's happened, this massive boom. Pretty much everyone now has a dog. To my mind, oftentimes they're now just considered a must-have accessory to be part of the in crowd.
Yeah.
But back in the early part of the 20th century, I don't think that was the case, because life was extremely different.
Well, let me say this about, I mentioned that we really did invent the modern pet as we know it in the 19th century. At the turn of the 17th century, when the 1800s are starting, at the turn of the 18th century, when the 1700s are ending and the 1800s are starting, Europe's leading dog expert wrote a book, and he was able to name 14 different breeds of dogs. 100 years later, when the 20th century is about to start, the new dog expert writes a book and he is able to list 200 breeds of dogs. Where do you think those dogs were coming from? We were literally inventing different breeds of dogs all through the century. Because, like I said, we did invent the modern pet the way we know it. We were inventing those breeds, and there was such a mania for pet ownership. What you're saying is true. There were people who were remarking on, this kind of 19th century replacement theorem, that people were going to kind of die out and we were going to stop having children and just have these dogs instead. And there were these editorialists in the paper who were sincerely alarmed by this. It's like people aren't they're going to stop breeding. They're just going to take these dogs and we're all going to die off.
So
It was a
funny.
mania. Yeah,
Yeah.
mania.
Well, I don't, yeah, but I mean, I'm single. I don't have children. I have three pets, so I can get it. Actually, I think, animals do so much for us, which of course takes us back to the fact they deserve a good death. But
Absolutely.
there are some amazing, I mean, some of the famous one, of course, is by Lord Byron's Boatswain. And on a couple of occasions, I've had to read the epitaph of Boatswain's magnificent grave, and oh gosh, there was one occasion I couldn't actually get through it because it's so emotional. And that's what I find, particularly going through your book, that the inscriptions on the graves, they're not, that they're more emotional, more heartrending, more
Yes.
heartbreaking than you see on human epitaphs. It's like
Yes.
Auntie Jane died. There might be something like
Eh,
that. Whereas,
eh,
Byron's here, beauty without vanity,
yeah.
strength without insolence, courage without ferocity, and all the virtues of man without his vices. I mean, and it
And
goes
he
on.
adds something. There's something in there. I think he says if I ever had a friend, this is where he lies, something like that. It's really touching. I agree with you. I am much more attracted to the inscriptions in animal cemeteries and human cemeteries. And the reason why I spent a lot of time thinking about this, obviously, when it comes to mourning the human dead, we're bound by a kind of rhetoric. There's this rhetorical language that we need. There's a kind of reserve to it. When it comes to animals, all rules are off. There is no rhetorical method for mourning an animal. It's up to you. We have our own language, and people speak a lot more intimately and a lot more openly about their pets than they do about their human relations. It's like you go to a pet cemetery, you'll see things that will break your heart. They'll make you laugh. There's humor. There's just general weirdness. There's this lovely grave. There's a picture of it in the book up in Rossendale, England. It says Judy killed by a tractor. She never told a lie. It's like there are messages there that really no one really understands but the owner, and they're opaque to everyone else. But they're so charming and they're so personal and they're so intimate, and that's what makes it wonderful.
Absolutely. And what tickled me a bit in the book as well was Keats, who wasn't it Keats who befriended or tamed a wild trout that lived in his part of the river, and the trout lived for 20 years. I
It,
mean,
well, yeah, it
I just
wasn't
don't think,
Keats. It was a man named Ketty.
oh,
And
sorry.
no, it's okay. It wasn't the famous Keats. It was a man named Kitty, and he lived in central England. And there's a wonderful story here because he had taken this trout as a friend, and the trout, he said, was so tame that it would eat out of his hand. And and so when this trout died, he found this trout dead in his stream eventually that ran through his property. So he gave it a grave in his yard with a little wooden grave plaque. And this trout grave was known in the 19th century. People had written about it. It was kind of legendary. And when I was writing the book, I was like, I gotta track down that trout grave. And and so I went to this town in England and I tried to figure out exactly where this house would be. And then I went up to this property and I literally I just knocked on the door. And the lady answers the door, and I say to her, excuse me for bothering you, ma'am. Do you happen to know if in the 19th century there was a grave for a trout here? Which is a very strange question if I've got the wrong house. And and yeah, I was talking to someone yesterday, and he said, the stories of you finding some of these graves may be better than the stories of the graves themselves. So I knock on the door, and I literally just said to her, yeah, do you know if in the 19th century there was a trout buried here? Had a grave here? And she looks at me, she's like, yes. And I was like, oh, this is the right house. And a guy yells from the other room, it's like, what is it, dear? And I was like, someone's here about the trout grave. And he's just like, oh, well, I guess you should bring him in. And so they let me in, and they're like, yes, we still have the grave plaque. It's in the laundry room. So they had bought the house, they had bought the property, and the Trout's grave was still there, and it was deteriorating terribly. And so they moved it into the laundry room, and they put it in a glass box, like a plexiglass case, so it wouldn't deteriorate anymore. So they let me come into the laundry room and take pictures of the Trout's gravestone.
It's extraordinary. It's absolutely brilliant. I
But
mean, can you
can you
remember?
imagine if
I'm
I
afraid.
picked the wrong house, though? You know, they're like, call the police. Some lunatics here looking for a dead trout.
It's, oh gosh, have you? Can you memorize? I'm looking frantically, flicking through the book as we speak to
I
find
don't.
it.
It's in chapter one. It just says it's a poem. It's actually really lovely. I don't know it by heart. Something about in this stream, the old trout, under this ground, the old trout does lie. 20 years he lived and then he died, something like that. And he was so tame, don't you understand? He would feed out of my hand. Something to that extent. It was rhymed, and it's really quite lovely about this man who loved a trout. But that's part of the beauty to me of this book. It's like, we always think of it as cats and dogs, and there's a lot of other species. We've got a picture of a grave for a snail in there, in I think it's Surrey in England. I found the grave of a crocodile, which is a very strange pet to have in England, especially. There's a pet lion that I talk about, a couple pet lions, but a really beautiful story about a woman who owned a pet lion in Los Angeles. So it's all different kinds of pets. And again, it's part of the universal aspect of it that humans can bond with almost any kind of animal, and they can bond with us if we have enough patience and we have enough love.
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, the story of Tawny, wasn't it? The
Yeah, the
lion
lion, yeah.
in LA, and so kind of quickly flying over back to the States now. But that story was extraordinary because the lion was born in captivity to a circus and
Yeah.
being badly treated. And who was the wonderful woman who rescued this lion and stood up for this lion, because the lion lived for
Yeah.
22 years.
The woman's name was Mary McMillan, and back in the day in Los Angeles, in the early 20th century, lion farms were a big amusement. Nowadays, we'd look at them as cruel and abusive, but there would be these lion farms, usually with these kind of older, infirmed lions that couldn't really hurt anyone, and people would go there and take their pictures with them, and it was just a thing to do, before Disneyland was built, I guess, go visit the lions. And as you mentioned, a lot of the owners of these types of places, these circuses and other animal farms, they're abusive towards the animals, and the animals are not treated well. And this woman, Mary McMillan, rescued a cub by the name of Tawny, who was, starving and abused in a lion farm, and wound up taking him as a pet, truly bonded with him in, just as you would bond with a cat or dog. Very tame animal, very, very beloved animal because she had raised him. She had raised him, fed him by her hand. Eventually, Tawny winds up as one of the MGM lions. MGM Pictures, they have the lion at the beginning of their films.
It's just
And
brilliant to know
yeah,
that that is this lion when
well, one
anyone
of them, one
watches.
of them. Yeah,
Oh, only
because
one. Okay.
they had a lot of them. And they actually have an official list. It was always rumored that Tawny was the MGM lion. Well, there's no single MGM lion because they would reshoot this spot a lot. But uh this is Hollywood and she has a tame lion. So you can imagine there's going to be a lot of work for him in the motion pictures. So Tawny featured in the Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films. And eventually, there was this rumor that he was one of the MGM lions, and people said, well, he's not on the official list. He's actually not one of them. Mary McMillan eventually had to go to court over the lion, interestingly, not for keeping a dangerous animal, but for disturbing the peace, because he would roar at night and keep the neighbors awake. So the neighbors tried to sue her for the lion. And so she had to go to court. And when she was deposed, they were asking her about her sources of income, and she mentioned renting him to MGM for the spots. So he did some of those spots. And anyway, so she's living in this suburban neighborhood with this lion, and this lion has Mary, but he's this like sole cat in the urban jungle, And one day this tomcat shows up, this big, strong tabby cat, and he decides he's going to move in too. He's a stray cat, the lion's a stray cat. They just kind of become buddies. They have this in common, even though one is big and one is small, and they become the best of friends. And it's a really touching story. Mary names the stray cat Cinderella. And I guess because, it may be in Tawny the lion, this stray cat has found his prince and they become best friends. They live together in that yard. And when Tawny the lion gets old and his teeth start to go bad and he can only eat porridge, Cinderella, the little tomcat, will come over and lick his face clean, to preserve his dignity. So there's not porridge on his whiskers. And Tawny would put Cinderella on his back, and like the little cat would ride around like a cowboy riding a horse on the lion's back. It's a really amazing story. And so when Cinderella the tomcat died, he died first, probably in 1939. Mary preserved the body. She had him buried in her yard. And then the lion goes into depression, probably because his best cat buddy has died, dies a year later. And so Mary takes him to the Pet Cemetery in Los Angeles to bury him, but she also disinters that tomcat and she buries them together because they were friends in life and they're going to be friends forever in eternity. So they're both lying together in the same grave. And in the picture on the grave, you see instantly the lion because there's a lion. But if you look closely at the picture, you'll see that sitting on his back there's a tiny little, there's this tabby cat, there's this tomcat sitting on his back, just like they were in her yard, just like in life.
Gosh, it's amazing. But,
It is.
I mean, at that time, I suppose, last century, there was a lot, keeping wild animals wasn't that extraordinary. I mean, there's a story about the young guys in the early 70s that bought a lion in Harrods. I mean, that was kind of how mad it was. At one point, you could actually buy a lion in Harrods, the huge department store. They don't sell lions there anymore. In fact, they don't sell any live animals at all now. But, back then with the cinema and so on, there a lot of people, quite a few people would keep animals like monkeys and
Yeah.
exotic birds and so on, would they not?
Oh, sure. Well, and I don't really consider it a good chapter in the history of animal ownership. Mary McMillan and her lion are a great chapter in the history of animal ownership because she was very good to that lion and she dedicated her life to him. But it used to be in the United States, you could just order them out of a catalog. I mean, there'd be mail order catalogs, and you could just order yourself a monkey and they'd mail it to you in a cage. I mean, it's terrible. It's abusive. But yeah, you used to be able to order them. Out of catalogs, but in that pet cemetery, that same pet cemetery in Hollywood, because that was the Hollywood Pet Cemetery, there are all kinds of exotic animals, many of whom were performing animals in the movie. They're buried there. Mae West's monkey is in that cemetery, and that monkey had performed in movies with her. There's a chimpanzee named Jiggs in that pet cemetery. Jiggs had performed in several motion pictures, and in fact was the only animal with an actual card in the Screen Actors Union and the Screen Actors Guild. They had given one to this monkey, several performing birds. So yeah, there are a lot of exotic and curious animals in that Hollywood Pet Cemetery because of Hollywood.
Yes, well, of course, but there's also a lion, I think, buried in the Paris cemetery.
There is a lion buried in the Pear Cemetery. There's a lion buried in the New York Pet Cemetery too, in Hartsdale, New York. Although that is a rather unfortunate situation with a very eccentric woman who had to own everything she could find. That lion was forced to live in a hotel room, and things did not turn out well.
Gosh. Well, we'll let everybody read about that. But, perhaps the most interesting part of the book for me is that, I'm a massive dog lover. And also, I spent 2 years living and working in Paris. And in that time, in my mid-20s, loads of people obviously came to visit me. It was like a hotel. And everybody, or a lot of people, wanted to go and see Jim Morrison's grave. And of course, Père Lachaise, the famous celebrity graveyard for people on the east side of Paris, where Balzac and Oscar Wilde are buried and lots more. So I did that several times. But all along at that time, I wasn't aware that there was arguably, perhaps, would you say, the biggest pet cemetery in the world, or one of them, Paul, the Cimitières des Chiens, on the west side of Paris?
It's not the biggest, but it's kind of the crown jewel. That cemetery was founded on an island in the Seine, so their piece of land is actually fairly small, and they've had to disinter a lot of burials to fit new ones. But I would call it the most historic, because the cemetery des Chiens is it is like the Père Lachaise of animal cemeteries. It is the famous, elegant animal cemetery. I would call it the most iconic pet cemetery.
And they struggled, I mean, it all started at the end of the, the late 1800s
Yeah.
again, so very Victorian. But there's such a story, about how several animal lovers, that were artists, they were the creative people, the intelligentsia really of Paris, because Paris has always had that air about it, which just appalled that the only way you could dispose of your dead pet would be to literally chuck it into the Seine,
Yeah.
and weight it down. I mean, you can't bear the thought of it really.
No.
Or, the horrible rendering it and turning it
Yeah.
into, I don't know
Glue.
what, glue or something,
Yeah. Fertile glue and fertilizer.
Oh, and so it is an interesting one because these people at the time, they fought for the rights, am I right,
Yeah.
to actually
Yeah.
have the cemetery there.
Yeah. The Pet Cemetery in Paris is we could call the one in London, we could call it we will call it the first urban pet cemetery, and it was founded as an act of charity. The one in Paris is a very different story because there was an actual plan. The one in London was founded accidentally. There's nothing accidental about the one in Paris. These people were demanding a better way to say goodbye to Paris's pets. It was necessary and it was important, not just for the emotional health of the owners, but for the health of the city as well. You don't want people dumping dead dogs in the Seine River, do you? I mean, the city of Paris was spending a lot of money every year just to clean up the river from all the dead dogs people were dumping in it. They needed a solution. So there was a lawyer and there was a journalist, and they banded together and they kind of founded a board to create a pet cemetery in Paris. It was founded by design. They wound up selling subscriptions. Basically, you could buy stock in the pet cemetery company, and they raised enough money to buy this small island in the Seine and turn it into Paris's first pet cemetery. They're, unlike Mr. Windbridge's, where, they just kind of start burying and everything's haphazard, they brought in an architect and they planned this thing out to give this cemetery the same elegance that a cemetery for human family members would have. Um, it's all done very much by design. And in addition, it also had the first potter's field for pets. So it was designed to really be a true public pet cemetery because, sure, if you were a rich person, you could build whatever fancy monument you wanted, but they also didn't want to exclude the poor people of Paris who loved their pets just as much. And so they had a little potter's field, like a free or cheap burial ground for poor people as well.
I mean, it's the most splendid place in the world. I mean, I really urge anyone, if you're going to Paris, take a trip over to Asnières, as you're saying, on the northwest side of Paris. But when you get there, I couldn't believe it the first time I went. I mean, I was just in awe. Those gates, the
Yes.
wall. I mean, it's stunning. And I just thought, yes, this is what dogs deserve. And it's
Yes.
Cimitières des Chiens. I mean, it's so Victorian. I mean, it's fantastic.
But this also got them into a little bit of trouble.
Oh, did it?
Yes, it did. Because, like I said, they brought in an architect and they designed it on the model of a human cemetery because they wanted to make this point that animals who lived as family members deserve the same type of respect at death. So they designed it as a miniature version of a human cemetery, but then the Catholic Church came around and they're like, what? Wait a minute, you're going to confuse people. And so the Catholic Church was able to extort an agreement out of them that they could do this, but they weren't allowed to use any religious imagery on the graves, just to not confuse people too much.
Yeah, and that's wonderful in a way inside because it's so dog centric and animal
Yeah.
centric, but it explains some of the great tombs in there, Paul, because we're leading to RIn Tin Tin, actually
Yeah.
that's why I traveled there the first time, having read this brilliant biography of Lee Duncan,
By
uh,
Susan Orlean. Yeah.
that's right, by Susan Orlean, and that's when I learned about this cemetery, to be honest. And I was just having to get there, and I went with my first bull terrier Molly, because my original plan was actually to bury Molly there because I would make sort of an annual homage back to Paris because I loved it there. I mean, who doesn't love Paris anyway?
Right.
And so I'd go and visit Moles. This was my great plan, but and then when I looked into it, though, getting a dead dog's body out of the UK and into France. There was going to be a lot of paper. It wasn't really ever going to be awfully practical. But Molly is now cremated, and you never know, maybe one day all our cremations will be scattered in the Cimitières des Chiens, because the one thing is for sure, isn't it, Paul? You go in there and the calm and the tranquility and the kind of eeriness. I mean, watching Molly, my bull terrier, go round all the tombs was really interesting. And in the book, your book, there's a picture of a lovely woman, probably circa 1920s because of her hat, with her two Great Danes. And I think they are in the Hyde Park Cemetery. And the dogs are really focused on the grave. You know, I'm a massive fan of a scientist called Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if you've
Oh,
read.
sure. Yeah. I know all about them. Sure.
Oh my gosh, it's episode 1 of my podcast, actually. Please listen to it. It's actually will always be one of my favorite episodes.
Whole thing with the psychic dogs. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And after death communication and sightings and so on. But it was, Molly was transfixed, you know, and she was really sniffing around and looking and staring. And I was thinking, you're seeing things here that I can't see. You're aware of some, you know, there was that. Do you agree? There was like kind of this presence of just happiness in this place.
Yeah. Animals tend to know, you know, because they, as you know, they don't rationalize things. They act intuitively. And so they tend to pick up on these sensitive things anyway. Tell you a story. I had a cat for 20 years that I truly loved. It was the closest relationship I've had with any living being. And I buried her in my backyard. Then I adopted another cat. The first time I let her out into the yard, she walks through the yard, turns, looks around, and makes a beeline to exactly where the other cat had been buried and just sat there, right there, staring at me.
Oh my
So
gosh.
they tend to know these things. But yeah, the cemetery in Paris, it's just such an idyllic place, you know. It's just as a little park. It's so beautiful with the greenery and with the trees. It's a wonderful place to take a living dog as well as a dead dog.
Yes, no, absolutely. It was really, really super, you know. But it was something I noticed when I was in there, that actually the newer the graves, the younger the dogs. You know, it was just a sort of passing thing I noticed. You know, so the modern graves, the dogs were all, generally speaking, a lot younger than the dogs that had died, you know, 100 years earlier, which is remarkable when you think the differences in science, or maybe not. Anna postulates.
Well, I don't know. Maybe we're feeding them junk food like we're feeding ourselves now. I don't know. That's an interesting point to make, because I had never noticed that. But one thing I do love about that Paris cemetery in particular is that it is old and it's got the old graves, but it's also new, you know, because it's continued to reinvent itself over time. So, for instance, there is a lovely little grave there. It's the smallest grave monument in any pet cemetery, and it's for a bee. And it's for this bee that you can scan the grave. The grave is linked to an Instagram account. And this bee that is buried in the grave died of pesticide poisoning. And so this grave for the bee is like, it's a modern grave that's a tribute to all bees, and it kind of links you online to these accounts and all this information about, you know, helping to preserve bees and all the good that they do, and how trying to, you know, prevent them from dying through pesticide. So it's one thing that I really love about that pet cemetery. It is old, but it's not stuck in the past. You know, the present is wedded to the past there in a very beautiful way.
Yeah, no, gosh, you see, I was there in 2012.
Yeah, long before the bee. Yeah.
Yeah, long before the bee, because I don't remember that. That's really, that's very on point, isn't it? Do you remember there was a grave that the main tombs actually, this kind of perspex ball that was filled with tennis balls that had obviously faded. And so they weren't yellow anymore. But, you know, I thought that one was lovely. So there was a lot of creativity there with the actual tombs, you know.
It's not stuck in the past.
No. So I went there, of course, to visit RIn Tin Tin's grave, which, you know, is wonderful. It's like pink marble. And there it is, Vedette, which stands
Grand
for
star of the
famous,
cinema.
Yeah, star of cinema, you know, and so on. But your revelation is probably kind of a world stopper. It's like, news alert. Go on, Paul. Explain.
If you're into dogs, this is a really big deal. So let's start with this. RIn Tin Tin is still to this day. I would say he's still the most famous and certainly the most iconic dog who's ever lived, right? Would you agree?
Oh, I would agree. I mean, look, he
Yeah.
saved Warner Brothers from bankruptcy in about
Yeah.
1930, right? And he earned more than Greta Garbo in
Yeah.
his whole lifetime. And
He
for a
was the
German Shepherd,
biggest film star.
he lived a long life. You know, I think he was 16 or 17 when he died. And this is a German Shepherd that lived, you know, in an era before, you know, all this medication and everything existed. And so he had a good long life, you know, Rin Tin
He,
Tin.
he was the biggest film star of his age. And by the way, mentioning the German Shepherd dogs, he's the reason for their popularity in the United States because nobody owned them before Rin Tin Tin. So the backstory for those who don't know it, German Shepherds were used by the German military. They were considered police dogs. And they were very rare outside of Germany, and they were almost unknown in the United States. An American GI discovered a puppy while he was serving in France in World War I, a puppy that had been in a German kennel that had been bombed out. And so he took this puppy and he smuggled him back to the United States. That man was Lee Duncan, Rin Tin Tin's trainer, and that dog was Rin Tin Tin. So Rin Tin Tin was born in France as a German war dog and then abandoned when the German troops retreated and taken back to the United States. Anyway, um, Susan Orlean goes on in her book about the biography, and he winds up becoming this big Hollywood star. My interest was the grave because there's a weird aspect to this. Okay, so Rin Tin Tin, he dies in Hollywood in 1932. That's well documented. But
Wasn't there a minute, Paul? I'm sorry, just to
yeah,
interrupt. I think there was a whole minute silence on the airwaves globally to mourn his death. Like, you know, on Armistice Day and so on, you have a minute silence. When Rin Tin Tin died, the airwaves went quiet for 1 minute. Is that
oh,
true?
I don't know. I don't. I certainly doubt it's a world thing, but in some places they did have a moments of silence on the radio. In all the cinemas in the United States, they kind of like, how in the United States they put the flag at half mast. Like their version of it was to like show like a blank screen for a moment because this famous star had passed. So yeah, it stopped the world because the most famous dog had died. He dies in 1932, and he's buried in Lee Duncan's backyard. This much is absolutely certain. There is an old document from a guy at NBC that was never published where he talks about going to Lee Duncan's house after Rin Tin died and seeing the grave. The grave is described. There's an old photograph taken at the house that clearly shows a cross and a white rose bush with a German Shepherd puppy sitting by it. That is clearly Rin Tin Tin's grave. So Rin Tin Tin was buried in the yard, yet somehow he has this grave in Paris. Okay, weird. Question is, how does he get to Paris? And Susan Orlean, in her book, and I love her book, it is a great book, but she fumbles the grave. And the question is, how does he get to Paris? And she has no explanation. The explanation has always been this. By the time Rin Tin Tin died, he was not the same star he had been because the talkies had started. Animal films like Rin Tin Tin films were great in the silent movie era. Animals obviously can't speak, they can't deliver the dialogue. So when the talkies came in, all the animal stars, not just Rin Tin Tin, they all started losing roles. So by the time he died, Lee Duncan was already in financial trouble because he had overspent. He winds up losing that house. That house gets foreclosed on the same year that Rin Tin Tin dies, and he has to move. So the story has always been, okay, well, he's losing the house, so he exhumes the dog and sends it to Paris to be reburied in this iconic dog cemetery as a nod to, French patrimony. That, since Rin Tin Tin was born in France, it's appropriate that he should be buried in France, even though it's a little weird when you think about it. He's a German war dog, right? In a war against France, but this is the story that we've been led to believe. The problem is there is not a single piece of documentation on the American side about that dog having been sent. And you just talked about the documentation that would be needed and the bureaucratic difficulty of mailing a dead dog to another country for reburial. Not a single piece of documentation exists saying that Rin Tin Tin was sent. Not a single piece of documentation exists saying that Rin Tin Tin was received on the French side. In Lee Duncan's archives are all at the University of California, Riverside. There is not a single letter, Not a single written word, not a single telegraph, nothing that says anything about this dog being moved from that house and being sent to France. Absolutely nothing. So this is nothing but a hypothesis. And I always found it hard to believe because I have a background in death studies. Before this book, I had written 3 books about death. And I know you just can't mail Rin Tin Tin's body to France. It doesn't work that way. In addition, let's say he was sent in 1932, the year that Lee Duncan loses the house, because that's where he's going to have to do it, right? Because someone else is living in the house after that. In addition, there is not a single mention of Rin Tin Tin being in that cemetery until 1948. The newspapers don't even talk about Rin Tin Tin being there, which is weird because you'd think if the most famous, iconic dog in history is suddenly given a reburial in France, that would be big news. And when he is mentioned in 1948, it's a weird article. It's an article in a French newspaper about all the famous animals who are buried in that cemetery. Rin Tin Tin is the most famous dog ever, but he's not mentioned until the very end of the article. At the very end of the article, it just says, oh, by the way, Rin Tin Tin, the movie dog, is also buried there. And Rin Tin Tin was a huge star, not just in the United States, but around the world. So you would think it's like, that's weird. Why wouldn't that be, why wouldn't that be the lead thing in the article about famous dogs buried in the cemetery? I puzzled over this for a really long time, and I searched and I searched, and I finally found my answer, and it is a shocker. I finally found my answer in a French cinema magazine from the 1940s. There was an obituary in the 1940s in this French cinema magazine for Rin Tin Tin. But wait, why is there an obituary in the 1940s for a dog who died in the 1930s? The reason is because it's a different dog. An
I
actor by
know.
the name of Teddy Michaud, he was a kind of second-rate French comedic actor. He had acquired a German Shepherd and started training him for the screen, and he named him Rin Tin Tin. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, I know. It's a bizarre story. And this guy was a real con man because he claimed that his Rin Tin Tin was the son of the original Rin Tin Tin, mated with a Brazilian wolf in Rio de Janeiro. And by the way, I checked this out. Rin Tin Tin had never been in Brazil. Furthermore, I've asked dog trainers and dog breeders what would happen if there were wolves in Rio de Janeiro, what would happen if I tried to mate a German Shepherd with one? Would it just turn out like a normal German Shepherd? And they just stared at me, jaw agape, and said, you're a lunatic. What are you talking about? And in addition, one more thing, the original Rin Tin Tin would have been dead by the time Teddy Michaud's dog was conceived. So this was a complete scam to try to break his dog into the films, into films in France. And it did work. His dog did get parts. There's a movie called Les Loups de Malvenor, The Wolves of Malvenor, that features Teddy Michaud's Rin Tin Tin. I was even able to get some film stills showing the dog, who is just a normal German Shepherd. He's got a different color muzzle than the original Rin Tin Tin, and he dies in the 40s. There's an obituary for that dog in this French cinema magazine, and it mentions this. It says his funeral is set or the Cimitières des Chiens. So he's being buried in that dog cemetery. This is why the first time his grave is mentioned, they don't say Rin Tin Tin, the Hollywood dog, the most famous dog ever, is buried here. They just said Rin Tin Tin, the dog from the movies, is here. Because it's that Rin Tin Tin. And they knew that. It's Teddy Michaud's Rin Tin Tin. It's a different dog. And by the way, you describe the grave, which is beautiful. I found pictures of the original grave because that's not the original grave either.
Oh,
That,
no, no.
no, the original grave is just a tiny little plaque that says movie dog Rin Tin Tin set over by the bushes because it was Teddy Michaud's Rin Tin Tin, not the Hollywood Rin Tin Tin. But you know how things go. Rumors spread, word of mouth spreads. People like Rin Tin Tin's buried in the dog cemetery in Paris, and eventually it winds up on the internet, and eventually it winds up in all the tourist guides, and the books talk about it. It's like if you want to visit the grave of the most famous dog in history, Rin Tin Tin, the movie dog, is buried in Paris. And eventually some fans, admirers of Rin Tin Tin, get some money together and they build this really nice, big looking grave, the modern one that you're talking about, because it's Rin Tin Tin. It's the most famous dog ever, and he's got to have a grand grave. It's just that it's the wrong dog. And anyway, when I was working on this, I realized, I started looking into Lee Duncan, and I realized that his daughter is still alive. Get this. Lee Duncan's daughter is still alive. She's an old lady and she lives in Florida. And I was like, wait
Wow.
a minute, Duncan's daughter is alive. And so I was able to get her phone number and I tracked her down and I called her up on the phone. I was like, hi, excuse me, ma'am. Hate to bother you. You're the daughter of Lee Duncan, the Hollywood animal trainer, right? And there's a kind of pause, like, yes. I was like, I'm working on a book about pet cemeteries. And there's a story that RIn Tin Tin is buried in the dog cemetery in Paris. And she's like, that is so stupid. I was like, I know, and I can prove that it's not him. And there was this pause, she's like, good for you. Because she knows it's not true.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, did you get to meet her? Did you get
No,
to?
no. I only had the one phone conversation with her. But this leads also, then we've got, let's call it the money question. If Rin
Mm.
Tin Tin's not in Paris, where is he?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
that is more difficult because I asked his daughter that. She says, I honestly don't know. Because, okay, so his daughter was born after they lost the house, after they got a ranch in Riverside, California. And I asked her, it's like, did he move Rin Tin Tin's grave to Riverside? She said, not to my knowledge. There was no grave in Riverside, and he never spoke about it. She told me that for the rest of his life, her father never mentioned anything about Rin Tin Tin's grave, which seems weird, but I think with the conclusion I draw, I think I know why. I went back after she told me that, and there was only one place in Los Angeles where Rin Tin Tin could have gone, which was the Pet Cemetery in Hollywood.
mm.
And so they searched all the records for Lee Duncan's name in 1932, the year he lost the house, the same year Rin Tin Tin died. There is no record of him being exhumed and taken to that pet cemetery. And there's also no record under Lee Duncan's name in the crematory because they had their own crematory. So the other question is, all right, did he dig him up and just have him cremated and keep the ashes? And there's absolutely no record of Lee Duncan going to that pet cemetery. So the only conclusion I could draw is that Rin Tin Tin was never moved. When he lost the house, I think he left Rin Tin Tin in his grave. Rin Tin Tin was buried in a giant brass casket with his favorite squeaky toy.
Oh, yes,
That's
yes.
Yeah, that's how he was buried, in a brass casket with his favorite squeaky toy. And I think Lee Duncan left him behind, which, so when I moved out of Los Angeles, I had a cat buried in my backyard. And the last thing I did, I thought about it, like, shit, what am I going to do about my cat? Because I love her. Okay, I'm going to take her. So I wound up exhuming her and taking her with. And I've talked to other people who've done it, but I've talked to more people, a lot more people, and they hear that story who will tell me this. They will say, when I moved, I left my dog or I left my cat buried in the backyard, and I've always regretted it because now my dog or cat is in a place I have no access to. A lot of people do it and they don't think about it and then they regret it. I think I'm just projecting. This is just a theory on my part. I think that's why Duncan never spoke about the grave because I think it broke his heart that he wound
Oh,
up leaving his dog in a place that he no longer had access to, which would mean that Rin Tin Tin, the most famous iconic dog in history, is buried in somebody's dog in somebody's backyard in Beverly Hills, and they have absolutely no idea that under their yard is a brass casket with the most famous dog who's ever lived. And I'll tell you one other tangent about this. So when I was wrapping up the book, I I randomly looked up that address that Duncan, because I kind of scoped it out by satellite, looked at the property to see if the property lines could have changed, like where might that dog be? That property suddenly listed as for sale. And I know realtors in Los Angeles, and I called a friend of mine who's a realtor. He's like, okay, look, tell him this. Tell him you have a buyer. He's a really eccentric guy, but he's interested in the property, and he just needs to come down with a metal detector because he's checking the feng shui of the yard. Just some outrageous story to allow me in there with a metal detector to see if I can find a giant brass casket under the ground. And I had this whole thing planned. I was like calling companies that make professional metal detectors that can tell you like even what type of metal it is and how far down. And then I thought about it and I was like, no, let sleeping dogs lie. If that
Literally. Yeah.
if that is what that is Duncan's dog, not my dog. And if that is what Duncan chose to do with his pet, it is not my place just to get a story. It is not my place to stick my nose in and tell the world that RIn Tin Tin's under this guy's backyard. Not my place. It's Duncan's dog. It's what Duncan wanted, and Duncan left him there. So I didn't do it.
Wow, gosh, that's extraordinary. But what if they do some building works or something, and discover this casket, and then
I don't know. But my fear has been, what if they put in a swimming pool?
oh, yes, well, that's what I mean. Something that will, literally unearth this great, because the brass casket, I mean, I'm sure it was really, good quality back
Of
then,
course. Yeah. Oh,
yeah, of course, it
absolutely.
would have been the best. It would have stood the test of time.
I think that, and I've wondered that too. It's like, I don't want anyone throwing RIn Tin Tin away. I suspect that if you were digging in your yard and you found a dog in a brass casket, you'd have to stop what you were doing and say, okay, what is going on here? And look into it. So I think if he's meant to be found, he will be found, because I don't think anyone's going to throw away anything buried in a brass casket. That just kind of screams out, stop, this is important.
Yeah, well, of course. So let's hope so, but
Let's hope that wherever he is, he's left in peace. That's what I think is appropriate.
yeah, and this whole Paris thing, I was thinking about it. Really, in a way, it's great that it is there, and maybe it's been wonderful for people that have been interested in dog history and RIn
Yeah.
Tin Tin to go somewhere to just
Yeah.
think
To leave
about
the
him,
flowers. Yeah.
to leave the
What,
flowers. I left a little plant pot on there as well, and just to remember him, really. So
well,
it's a
guess what?
symbol.
Here's something funny too. The people who run that cemetery, they know it's not him. Because I've
Yeah,
asked them. No, I'm serious. Like, if you walk in and say to them, where's RIn Tin Tin's grave, the Hollywood movie talk, they're going to point right there. But I've asked them. I've been to that cemetery. It's like, that's not him. They're like, oh, yeah, we know. It's like, okay, do you know who it is? It's like, yeah, it's his son or something. It's like, okay, well, it's not his son. The guy claimed he's his son, but it's not the real RIn Tin Tin. They actually know this, but you have to know in advance and ask them the right question to get them to acknowledge it. And the reason is, it's not duplicity. They're not trying to, it's like they're not making a bunch of money by having RIn Tin Tin's grave there. It's not like people are coming and paying $100 to drop a flower there. I think it's just because they don't want to disappoint people. And it's exactly what you said. It gives people who love cinema history and who love that dog and who love German Shepherds, or who just understand the historical importance of this dog. It gives them a kind of temple at which to worship. And so I think that's the reason they don't publicly acknowledge it, because they don't want to ruin people's expectations.
yeah, exactly. And when you get in there, there's so much
There's
more
so
to
much more,
see.
so much more.
And
Yeah.
this whole, you know, homage really and respect to animals just
Yes.
oozes through, which is something extraordinary, actually, I must say. So yeah, but wow, what a story. I mean, now when people read your book, because it's only been out in the UK for a week,
Yeah.
so I'm really lucky to have a copy here, and it's amazing, that's all I can say. And
Thank you.
it's going to get out. I mean, do you think this is going to cause a bit of a commotion? Because nobody knew, really. I mean, you discovered it. Everyone else just took it as, yeah, this is RIn Tin Tin's grave. I did, why would I question it? But now people could be questioning. I mean, no one's going to be cross, of course, but yeah, it does put it into a different perspective.
Well, I don't know how much it changes, to be honest, because, I have got the entire internet to battle against in order to change public knowledge that this is not Rin Tin Tin's grave. And the entire internet is a really big foe, when it comes to, it's funny because they call this the information age, and it should really be the misinformation age. I think it's gonna, uh, I did write that article about Edna writing the Rainbow Bridge, and by now it's been maybe a year and a half. By now, people are starting to understand that the Rainbow Bridge has an author, and they're beginning to know who she is. So I think maybe over time people will come to understand that that's not really Rin Tin Tin's grave, but it takes a long time when the rest of the internet's telling them one thing, and you're out in a corner, kind of waving your hand, saying, "Well, wait a minute."
Mm. Yeah, no, for sure. But Rin Tin Tin, la grande vedette du cinéma, it's good, it's great. And he set the way, for the Uggies of this world, another, in the silent movie, a modern film, but you must remember Uggy in oh no, hang on, it was called The Artist, the film called The Artist. It was brilliant. It was set in the silent movie era, just at that point where, history changed into the talkies, because it was a big moment, wasn't it, for
Yeah.
cinema, all that
Well,
era.
I don't think people really can comprehend how big Rin Tin Tin was, because a lot of, most of those silent films don't exist anymore. At the time, keep in mind, at the time, cinema itself was only a few decades old as a popular medium, so people really didn't know how to store those. And so, bad storage of films has destroyed so much of them. The vast majority of Rin Tin Tin's work doesn't survive. And, after he died, the lineage was carried on by other dogs. There was Rin Tin Tin Jr., his son, who started working in the United States, but he couldn't act. And so they got another dog to pretend to be his son. And then he had a grandson who actually could act a bit, and they kind of carried on with him. So I think his cultural product has kind of been debased, by just kind of crass consumerism and a desire to make a buck off a famous name. But I don't think people really understand how good he was, because Rin Tin Tin would even do all his own stunts. And there was a real concern at the studio. It's like, we really want to find this dog a stunt double because we don't want him hurting himself. He's too important. But no one was as good as Rin Tin Tin. He could act, he could do all his own stunts, he could emote. He was the real deal.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And he also really represented the American dream, I think. Every
Yeah, well, in a way, I don't know if you remember this part of the story, but Rin Tin Tin couldn't get a break. And they didn't want to cast him because he had a dark muzzle. And they said, no dogs with dark muzzles. They don't look good on screen. They don't photograph well in black and white. And Lee Duncan's friend had a camera, and so but I mentioned that Rin Tin Tin did all his own stunts, and he was incredibly athletic, and so they just made a short film of Rin Tin Tin jumping over incredibly high objects that would play, before the main feature in some cinemas, and people became kind of obsessed with it. It was like the equivalent of a viral video. It's like, oh, you got to see that little short movie of the dog who jumps over high things. And eventually, the studio was at a loss because they had a dog movie and they didn't have a dog because whatever dog they had cast, there was some problem. The dog had to drop out. They're like, we need to shoot this thing. It's like, I don't know. Okay, call that guy with the dog that jumps over high things. Just call that guy because at least his dog's super athletic. And from that was born Rin Tin Tin. So in a way, you said he represents the American dream. He really kind of does. He was a foreigner. He was an immigrant dog that was found in a bombed out shelter. I mean, talk about a rough start to life. An abandoned dog that was smuggled back by a USGI. A dog that could not get a break. No one would take him seriously just because he didn't look right. And in the end, he becomes the biggest star in the world.
extraordinary, it's extraordinary. But every dog is a superstar, and
I agree. I
the
agree.
great thing to their owner. And it is funny you mentioned about taking your cat with you, because I did do the same with Molly, who visited the not the real Rin Tin Tin's grave when I moved. And then and I'm very, very happy I did that. So
Yeah.
I think it's something people should think about a bit, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people, and this is kind of changing the topic, but it's related. When I was working on this book, I spent a year as a volunteer grief counselor for people whose pets have passed. And just because I've experienced the loss of a pet in my own terms, but to truly understand, I needed to experience it through other people's terms, to understand what they were feeling, to understand if what I was feeling was unique. And and to understand how universal some of these feelings were. And let me tell you, there's a reason I did it only for a year, because every day somebody left me in tears, every day listening to these stories. It's rough. But the one piece of advice I always gave people was, when your pet dies, take time to make the decision. In the United States, and I don't know about in the UK, but in the United States, if you have a pet that's euthanized, they will immediately walk into the room and say, okay, your pet's dead. Do you want us to take it away? Do you want us to send the body for incineration or whatever, and have it cremated or whatever? And they'll just take the body away. And everybody is at such a loss that most people just say yes. And it is a decision that so many people regret. If you have not thought it out beforehand, if they come and say, do you want us to take the body away? Say no. If you can do it, just wrap the body up in plastic, put it in your freezer, and just give yourself time to grieve and time to think. Because trust me, at that moment, you don't know what you want.
It's so right. I won't explain why, but well, actually, yes, with my cat Gremlin, who passed last year, it was so sudden. It was
Yeah.
like a juggernaut coming down the motorway at 100 miles an hour the wrong way to hit me, this whole thing, and he had been poisoned, actually, and no one
Oh,
could
I'm
figure it
sorry.
out. And no, yeah, and it was all awful and very fast, and, like I say, so unexpected. They were taking all the samples and everything. He had no cancer in his body. And yeah, so it was a bit of a sudden goodbye I had to do. And
Yeah.
I should have brought him home. I mean, I
Yeah.
kept Molly, my miniature bull terrier, in the freezer
Yeah.
for a good 2 weeks, actually,
Yeah.
before. And it's something that actually is still really bugging me a year
Yeah.
on. And I have his ashes just here in this room in his bowl that has Gremlin on it, his name. And yeah, the connection. This is why I really love your book so much, because it tackles everything, and this great love, it's a tricky one. Paul,
Yeah, it is. It
it's a
is.
tricky
It's
one.
the hardest thing, because when a pet dies, um, it's it's like losing a piece of yourself, because you, even a person that you love and that you've lived with for a long time, they're still a discrete individual, but a pet becomes a part of you. They're like a weird mirror image of you. You know what I mean? It's like they literally become a piece of you. So when a pet dies, it's like losing, I'm not saying that the grief is necessarily worse, it's just different. And it's a harder grief to process often, because when a pet dies, it is literally like losing a piece of yourself that you'll never get back again.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I mean, I think you've nailed it there. It's a piece of yourself. And that's why you feel so empty. And, I mean,
Yeah.
somebody said to me once, the first dog that you really, really love will completely shatter your heart. And then every dog that you have the privilege of bringing into your life thereafter will try and piece your heart together
Yeah.
again until you die with the heart of a dog.
Well,
And
can I please tell you this story because I love it? Is it short?
yeah,
Okay.
go.
So when I interviewed Edna, the original author of The Rainbow Bridge,
Yes.
we got to the end of the interview, and I said, Edna, I have one last question for you. And I said, what is your advice for a person whose dog has died? Because, she wrote The Rainbow Bridge for Major. And she, in this just beautiful Scottish voice, because I love the accent. She said to me, I'm not going to try to emulate it. Don't worry, but beautiful voice. She says to me, oh, you can't ask me that. It's like, of course I can ask you that. She says, who am I to tell people what to do? I was like, you're the expert. She's like, am I? I was like, Edna, you wrote the Rainbow Bridge, didn't you? She's like, yes. I was like, that makes you the expert. What's your advice for a person when their dog dies? And she immediately said, well, I'd tell them, go out and get another dog.
Well, there's a lot to be said. My dad used to say, the hair of the dog cure. It had nothing to do with
Yeah.
hangovers, but everything about, moving forwards. And certainly it's the distraction that you need. And
well, your old dog, the pet who passed, does not want you to suffer. It doesn't want you to be alone. And so these people who are like, I can never take another cat or dog because I loved Fluffy. It's like, you're only trying to prevent yourself from feeling that pain again. Don't worry. There's a new adventure. There's a new animal out there waiting to take you on a completely new adventure. And it's not an insult to the previous one.
No, that's right. I mean, shortly after Gremlin passed, this feral stray tomcat just landed on my doorstep in, really bad state. He needed help, and all the rescues were full for 3 months. So I had no choice but to take him in. And he lived in the garden for a bit and then moved in, and he's obviously still here. He's a funny thing. He's not a looker. Gremlin was stunning. He's got a broken jaw. He's had a broken jaw, and he's slightly cross-eyed, and he's got a bendy back leg. But he needed help. All the rescues were full. So, he stayed, and he's still here. And, technically I saved his life where I couldn't save Gremlin, so it was kind of this cyclical thing. And he definitely has helped in the whole process. Because I was, as you say, I can never have another cat again, particularly considering the circumstances of Gremlin. But anyway, so it's life, isn't it? And it's this wheel and this energy. And I think the Buddhists get it really quite good, don't they, with their thoughts of rebirth and energy and the universe and the like. But
I think so. I tend to gravitate towards that spiritually much more than Christianity.
Yes. But your book, amazing, and it's just come out in the States, I think, as well.
Next week.
Okay. Well, I feel so privileged to hopefully be one of the first, if not the first podcast to be airing all about it. It's thoughtfully printed. I love on all the pages, you have these lovely symbols of all sorts of different animals. There's pigs, there's ducks, there's fish. So it's really universal. It's not just about dogs and cats, and the photography and the history. And I just think, we shouldn't talk about Christmas now, but it's getting to that time. This would make the most perfect gift, I think, to anyone who's ever loved and lost a pet.
I appreciate you saying that. There was so much love put into that. I mean, that was that book almost drove me insane at certain times, because everything had to be precise. It had to be very meticulously done to show those people who pick it up that this is a book not just about love. It's a book that's been handled with love throughout the entire process.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, Paul, it's brilliant. And I can't wait for the next one.
Oh, no. I worked on that for 11 years, please.
Oh, well, look, Paul, thank you so much. So it's published by Thames and Hudson, and it's available, I'm sure, in all the good and the bad places where you can buy books, right?
Yeah, probably the bad places sell more, but you can go to the good places too.
Exactly. Faithful unto death. Well, Paul, thank you so much, and please keep in touch. And you're welcome.
Thank you, Anna.
On this podcast anytime.
Thank you.
You are radio gold, as they say.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's our show, Mr. Binks. What did you think? Yes, well, let's not talk about your death anytime soon. And you're right, it is time for Woof of the Week. May I just say that this book, Faithful Unto Death, by Dr. Paul Koudounaris, is literally a must read. So if you haven't already, please go to all the good and all the bad places to buy books and grab your copy now. And I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you did, which I hope you did, go on, please write a review, because it really makes a massive difference. Thanks again, of course, to Dr. Paul Koudounaris for joining us today. And thanks, of course, to Mike Hansen, my producer, for all the music and the production as ever. What's that, Mr. Binks? Yes, you're right. We will, of course, be back in your feed, as usual, next Sunday. But why don't you just take 2 minutes to subscribe, because it's free, and that way you'll never have to miss a show ever again. See you next Sunday. Bye for now.
Pod people.